Okay, thank you for the privilege of being here. I was here several years ago at a kind of similar conference, so it's nice to kind of come back and new people and hopefully get some good feedback. What I want to do today is address this question, which is I think a question that many of us are interested in, which is what's the source of our moral judgments? And I think there are some interesting payoffs to the answer to this question, that the idea will be that this will deepen our understanding of how the moral capacity develops in us as people, individuals, how it can possibly break down, and the extent to which it constrains our views of possible moral alternatives. The approach that my lab takes is a very cross-disciplinary one. I think this is the only way to go. We use the tools, both theoretical and methodological, from cognitive psychology, neuroscience, anthropology, evolutionary biology, developmental psychology, and philosophy. And so hopefully you'll get a flavor of a little bit of that today. Part of the reason I think that approach is important is because this is not going to be solved by one discipline. It's not going to be solved by a reductionistic view about the neurosciences. It's not going to be solved by just simply looking at development. It's going to require all these things to come together to get a real picture of what's going on. The thesis I want to try to defend today is that the source of our moral judgments is a cold, computational, and abstract capacity, or a generative faculty, that's in some ways like language. It's like language in the sense that in many ways it's going to be immune to certain kinds of contextual and cultural factors that normally perturb other ways of engaging in decision making. And I'm going to show you some examples of that today, I hope. So the first thing I want to do is just very quickly sketch sort of the general theoretical perspectives that have been, I think, floating in this field, some very rich ones. There's no time to go into this in any depth. I'm going to give it a very quick sketch just to sort of situate the view that I want to put forward today. And then I'll talk about some of the empirical work that bears on this kind of connection between the moral sense and some ways in which language works. And I'll talk about notions of abstractness and the impenetrability of some of these intuitions. And then lastly, I want to talk about the role of emotion, or perhaps the lack of role of emotion. This is not one that's going to go down well with some people in this audience, but so be it. Here we go. There have been sort of at least two very broad cuts. I think this was kind of nicely put in John Haidt's early paper in the early 2000s on the kind of intuitionist model, that being that often when moral psychologists have approached this problem, there's been a very heavy emphasis on the role of reasoning, conscious reasoning, in our decision-making process for moral judgments. And then kind of more recently, perhaps coming along with the wave of work in the cognitive sciences, a more intuitionist view that looks like kind of a fast, rapid, unconscious approach to what's right or wrong. Now, these two kind of coarse-grained cuts can be kind of further subdivided. The reasoning machinery course is going to be based on something like a rational, conscious, deliberative process that recruits very explicit principles. And those explicit principles could come from at least two different routes, or both. And that is explicit norms that people have in their society that are articulated, and people can recall them and express them, and of course also the law. A second view is that they come from a theistic perspective. They come from Scripture, for example, that where our morality comes from is from Scripture. We listen to those rules, we learn about them, we use them to guide our judgments of what's right and wrong. On the intuition view, again, it's going to be an unconscious process, but for many, the source of that unconscious intuition or gut feeling is a system that really engages in emotional processing. And then secondly is a view that critical to this unconscious intuitive system are a system of principles or rules that are very abstract that link causal intentional analyses to the consequences of certain kinds of actions. And clearly, both of these can and often do play a role. So to me today, what I want to push on is this kind of right side of the chart, and to see how much we can account for in the decision-making process by these kind of unconscious principles that link causal intentional processes to consequences. And for that, I'm going to lean heavily on kind of an analogy to the way that the language faculty works. So here's one way of thinking about these sort of three different pieces, or these two different pieces, and how they might contribute to a judgment at kind of the end of the day. So let's imagine kind of a hardcore emotional intuitive view. This may be a little bit faded out. But on top here, imagine you're walking down the street and you see somebody with a dagger in his hand standing over a dead body. Simply that perceptual event is going to trigger, one would expect, some kind of an emotional response. And that emotional response on this view might be sufficient to trigger a moral judgment. It would provide the source for how we decide whether something is right or wrong. Now, here's a view which combines basically some aspects of emotional processing with some aspects of conscious reasoning. Again, we see this event, we perceive it, that triggers some aspect of emotional process inside of the brain. It also treats some kind of conscious reasoning about the event we just experienced, and those two may be competing with each other or reinforcing each other, and then we alight on some kind of moral judgment. The view that I'm going to push on heavily today has the same ingredients, but the order in which they occur is very different, and that's the crucial part for today. There are obviously many ways in which this system could come about. Here's one view. You perceive the event, and that's the critical moment, because the unconscious systems that evaluate cause and intent and beliefs and desires and so forth, that's triggered, and that in and of itself is going to be sufficient to trigger the moral judgment. The moral judgment of right and wrong then can trigger an emotion and conscious reasoning, and these things can feed back on each other. So the crucial part here is that emotion and conscious reasoning are part of the system, but they happen after the moral judgment. Now, we could debate this forever, or we could actually try to figure out whether certain empirical findings would bear on distinguishing between these alternative hypotheses and many others. So let's imagine that we had patients with severe deficits in the emotional processing system, and that's all the deficit they had. That system was knocked out. Well, on this top view, if the emotional system is crushed, is damaged, is not working properly, then on that view, the moral judgment should be different. They should be perturbed from some sense of a normal system that has those emotions intact. On this view, any kind of moral scenario that would recruit the emotions, of course, would show perturbations in the moral judgments, but there may well be a whole suite of moral scenarios where the emotions are simply not recruited or not recruited sufficiently, and there the moral judgment would be fine. So if I asked you, all else equal, you can save one person or five, and then you don't know anything else but just the numbers, you might imagine that that system is totally cold. You save 5/1, all else equal. But on this view, if the emotions are damaged, it plays no role at all in the moral judgments because they happen downstream or after the moral judgment has occurred. Okay? So again, this is just one way of thinking about the possible landscape of possibilities. There are many, many more. It's just that here's a place now where the empirical work can begin to get an anchor on the decision-making process. So what I'll be talking a little bit about today is how work on psychopaths bears on this kind of questions, and I'll allude to in the end work on patients with damage to the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, an area that seems to be critically involved in linking decision-making with emotional processing. Okay, very crude, quick introduction. I'm sure the other speakers will build on these ideas. What I want to show you is really what empirical work my lab has brought to bear on some of these questions over the last few years. And we'll start with aspects that really bear on the linguistic analogy. So one of the ways in which we've done this, and we're not alone in this, is we've created a website called the Moral Sense Test. It's a place that people can log on to. They give us demographic information about who they are, how they were raised, where they come from, and so forth. And then they take a series of scenarios, or they read a bunch of scenarios, and they give us their moral judgments. To date, we have data from over about 250,000 subjects. This site, which really started out in English, has now been translated into several different languages. The age ranges that we're going to focus on come from about 13 to 70 years of age, different religious backgrounds, different educations, and there's a whole bunch of publications that have come out from students in my lab. Okay, so I want to focus on two aspects that I think are invited by making an analogy to language. The first is that if the moral faculty operates in some of the same ways as language does, then the system is based on a set of abstract and content-free computations or rules or principles or variables or something like that. And that is, the moral judgments will operate over variables that take different kinds of input, but not specific content. In other words, there is no rule that says, don't kill your mother. There is something having to do with don't harm certain kinds of people, perhaps. So we can begin to abstract away from the nature of harming and helping in a very abstract way that may begin to look a bit like language. The second part is that we'll look at the extent to which the computation that's driving the judgment is really obligatory and in some sense impenetrable to typical contextual or background factors that affect many aspects of decision making. And so here we'll look at whether moral judgments are given in some sense rapidly, automatically, and immune, for example, to a variety of cultural factors such as knowledge of the law, religious background, gender, and education. Okay, so over the last several years, several people, including some people in this audience, including Josh Green, my colleague at Harvard, have looked at certain kinds of abstract variables, parameters, distinctions that seem to affect the nature of our moral judgment. So I'm going to just show you a whole suite of them without saying too much about them. Those listed on the left are consistently perceived as worse than those on the right, again, holding all else equal. So typically speaking, means-based harms are perceived as worse than harms that come about as a kind of a side effect or a byproduct of some other goal. Actions are perceived as worse than omissions. Contactful harm, contacting an individual versus a non-contact mean, is worse. Linear or kind of more direct aspects of harm are worse than kind of non-linear or non-direct ways of harming. Using personal force to harm someone for some kind of mediated causal force or relationship, then personal force will be judged as worse. And the factor that I'd like to focus on today is an inevitable harm, where someone's going to be harmed already, is going to be perceived worse as an inevitable harm, something where someone was not going to be harmed by whatever action you're going to do. That's a distinction that's often been referred to, due to its creator, as a Pareto situation. And I want to focus on this today because it will showcase how the notion of inevitable and inevitable is truly abstract, is not based on any particular kind of content. Okay, so a couple of recent papers that refer to this issue are listed here in the lower left-hand corner. And the question we're going to ask is it the case that means-based harms are always worse or are always forbidden? Because the general line has always been that it's always bad to use someone as a means, even if there's a greater good down line. Okay. So here's a kind of a classic case. It's a classic case that Josh Green has used. It's in the philosophical literature. Imagine that it's wartime. 10 people are stuck in a bunker. Enemy soldiers are approaching. If the people in the bunker hear anybody, they will kill all 10 people in the bunker. A mother is holding her baby. Her baby is about to scream. The question is it okay for the mother to suffocate the baby, terminating the scream? Now, this is a tough situation, of course, because using the baby as a means for saving the lives of the 9 others is something that sort of puts the brakes on and says, no, don't do it. And yet, if you kind of think it through, so to speak, what you'll realize is the baby is going to die anyways. So this is a case, this is a case of harms which in some sense are inevitable. The baby will die no matter what happens. So thanks to Josh, we took some of the data that he had published in his 2004 paper and reanalyzed the data in terms of this distinction between Pareto-based cases, the inevitable harms, versus those that were evitable harms. And what consistently comes up in a wide variety of cases in terms of mean permissibility ratings is the Pareto-based cases are judged more permissible than are the non-Pareto cases. And because Josh collected reaction time data, we also find the very interesting effect that Pareto cases are judged more slowly than the non-Pareto-based cases. And one interpretation of this is, of course, if the first hit in the decision-making process is don't harm someone as a means to some greater good, but then you hold it off and begin to appreciate some level that you're not making the one worse off, that's going to be potentially a slow process. So what this seems to be revealing with a wide variety of cases is that if the harm is inevitable, it's judged more permissible even though you are using the individual as a means to some greater good. So we wanted to take this kind of very general analysis and broaden it to look much more specifically at the abstractness of this inevitable-evitable distinction and build in other kinds of factors that might titrate or affect this distinction. Because again, if the system is working anything like a grammatical computation, it's not about one parameter or one variable, about how those parameters interact in terms of the overall computation. Okay, so what I did together with Bryce Huebner and the philosopher Philip Pettit at Princeton was to create a family of dilemmas, all within, for example, one context where we titrated the Pareto factor versus the non-Pareto version of it. We then manipulated the nature of the agent of harm to see whether who was doing the harming made a difference in terms of this particular distinction. So we had two mechanical harms, classic trolley problems, as well as a wrecking ball case that was very much similar. Now it's a wrecking ball that's going to do devastation on people. Versus a natural agent, a fire comes out in a burning house and will harm some number of individuals. Versus two human agent versions. These come from actually Bernard Williams' famous case of Jim the Traveler traveling in a foreign land versus a kind of a rough area of a neighborhood that might be familiar to you. So again, human agent, natural agent, and mechanical agent. And here's the overall result. If you plot these, what you typically see is the cases are basically losing in terms of how permissible they are across these Pareto-based cases, but consistently it drops down then now when you get to the non-Pareto-based cases. Putting it differently, the mean judgment ratings for the Pareto cases are consistently higher across all these variants than are the non-Pareto-based cases. The variation that comes in here are quite interesting. For example, this case up here, which is judged typically the highest in all of these different versions, is a case where you use a dead body for the greater good. Now, clearly here, you are not making that individual worse off. The body is already dead, and that's okay. But interestingly, if you come to this case over here, which is judged much lower than here, this is using someone who is dying. It's a person who's got a sign that's just saying, I'm dying, do not resuscitate me, I've lived a great life, but you use them. So you are making them a little bit worse off, and this may be a case where just making them a little bit worse off ends up having a hurt case turn into a really harming case. You're reducing the amount of life to be lived, and that's being judged less permissible. So the main point I want to make here is that the distinction between evitable and inevitable, or Pareto versus non-Pareto, is completely abstract. It takes any kind of content, but it will be modulated a little bit by the nature of the agent and the nature of the form of the inevitable type of outcome that you're pushing. Now I want to turn to a couple of examples of the notion of the computation itself being impenetrable in many ways to certain kinds of contextual effects. And for this, we'll look at two examples. One is what the role of demographic and cultural background factors are in the pattern of judgments observed. And the second is what is the role of knowledge of the law in our judgments. So we're going to come back to the moral sense test, but this is the Dutch version of this. And the reason for looking at the Dutch, sorry, I'm one step ahead of myself. This first example is simply going to come from the English version of the MST. We have pooled across several years of data collected on this website. There are 10 data sets in total. Each data set had between 300 to 1,200 subjects per set. There were approximately 120 different kinds of dilemmas that varied in content, the nature of the action, including harming and helping cases. So very variable data set in terms of dilemmas. For each of the sets, we're going to look at the role of gender, educational level, religious background, moral coursework, and political affiliation in how these factors affect the patterns of moral judgment. So here's the pie of the proportion of variance accounted for by different factors. Here's the role of sex or gender. Here's the role of your political background. Here's the role of education. Here's the role of moral education. And here's the role of religion. In other words, the pie is virtually unexplained by these background factors. Everything else, non-demographic and non-cultural, specifically the parameters that we are manipulating, is what accounts for the pattern of variation. Now, because of the very large sample sizes, we can get statistically significant effects within some of these factors. Sometimes males judge in a more utilitarian direction than do females. Sometimes people who have a strong religious background end up being more deontological, more rule-based than do people who lack a religious background. These are statistically significant effects, but the crucial thing is what's called the effect size, which in some sense is how meaningful those particular variables are in explaining the variance you see. So the effect size goes from 0 to 1, and typically effect sizes in the range of 0.5, 0.6 are seen as variables that really are accounting for a lot of the meaningful variation. So here is now a breakdown of all those factors from sex, education, current religious background, your background religious background, the degree of religiosity, moral coursework, the number of moral books you've read, political affiliation, and an atheist versus a religious distinction. Now, if you can't see these bars, it's because they're almost non-existent. They're all below 0.1. They range typically from about 0.02 to 0.06. These variables are having no effect on people's moral judgments. Okay, what about the law? What about knowledge of explicit law? Could that drive our moral judgments? So a test case of this is a case that basically relies on a very interesting historical fact, which is that in 2001, the Dutch government no longer recognizes the legal distinction between active euthanasia and passive euthanasia. That is, in Holland, if you're in pain and suffering and there is no cure, you can give someone an overdose or you can allow them to die. Because of this legal distinction, which now obliterates an action versus omission distinction, the question we wanted to ask was, as a result of this distinction, do the Dutch no longer perceive a distinction between action and omission? In other words, do they no longer perceive this omission bias, where actions are worse than omissions? So we created a Dutch version of the moral sense test. There were 672 subjects. They read a whole variety of dilemmas, 31 dilemmas in total, but there were 5 pairs that were specifically targeting the action-omission distinction. Half of the subjects got those dilemmas first, and half first read about an explicit case of euthanasia and were asked about the moral permissibility of that, and then were asked about their knowledge of the legal distinction. So everyone was asked, is active euthanasia worse to, equal to, or less bad than passive euthanasia? Are you aware of the Dutch government's decision on euthanasia? And would you endorse this decision if it came up for a vote again? So remember, half of them are being explicitly made to think about the active-passive distinction, euthanasia, and the law. Here's what we found. The majority of the Dutch actually think that passive euthanasia is worse than active euthanasia. And that may seem a little counterintuitive, but it actually makes sense if you think about it. Allowing someone to die and stay in pain is not okay if you can terminate their life at that point in time. So they're aware of it, and they actually think the omission case is worse. Moreover, 90% of people said they were aware of the Dutch government's decision, and they would endorse it if it came up for a vote again. And yet, when you give them these artificial dilemmas that have nothing to do with euthanasia, the omission bias is there consistently in every single case and is indistinguishable from a comparable American population where this law does not exist, where only passive euthanasia is supported. So the idea here is that even though they're aware of the law, and even though they were primed to think about the difference or the lack thereof between action and omission, it has no effect on novel cases where this distinction holds. That's firing through obligatorily when the case is unfamiliar. So 2 conclusions here. One is that you've got, in some sense, a kind of an immunity or an impenetrability of these background factors to people's moral judgments. They're not weighing in heavily, significantly on the judgment, and that includes things like religion, gender, and education. And similarly, even when you prime people to think of an explicit case that they know about, it has no bearing either. Okay, what now about the role of emotion? Okay, now this is where James is going to have to be chained to his seat in order not to get too upset at me, but I'm going to give it a go and we'll see where we differ. Okay, so the question is, what is the problem with psychopathy? Where does the deficit lie? And there's been a huge amount of work here, and so this is going to be just one hit on this particular problem. So, of course, what's certainly acknowledged by many is there's certain kinds of emotional deficits. The nature of that emotional deficit is not entirely clear. So some people refer to a lack of empathy, a lack of guilt, shame, remorse, a whole constellation of emotions, but there's other things going on there, and so the clarity of the role of emotion is not clear, but that there is a deficit, I think everyone would agree. Other people have leaned on just simply their lack of kind of understanding or awareness of certain aspects of what is morally right or wrong. And so there's a lack of comprehension in some sense. And others have pointed to the fact that although their knowledge or understanding may be okay, the problem lies in their behavior. Their behavior is what's off-kilter. And this is an important distinction because it tends to bring up now something that's fundamental, I think, in the field of moral psychology, and that's what we can learn about moral judgments and what we can learn about real-world moral behavior. So much of what I've said today has to do with the judgment aspect. Here's a case where we can bring together judgment and behavior. Okay, so we had a 2-minute conversation before I just gave his talk, and James is already correcting me. So he's not going to be happy on the inhibitory problem, and he'll correct me in his talk. He will. See, he's already ready. But some people have claimed, and it's not James, but some people have claimed that there's a problem with self-control and impulsivity that comes out in psychopathy. Others have pointed to deficits in fear recognition. James has pointed to certain data looking at their appreciation of the role of punishment and reinforcement contingencies, and in his own work, distinguishing between a core distinction in the moral psychology literature, and that is between moral and conventional transgression. The typical kind of case goes like this. If a teacher comes into a classroom and says, today, don't bother raising your hand to ask questions and simply ask the question, children are okay with that. If the teacher says, in the United States, you raise your hand, but in France, they just ask the questions, the kids are not bothered by that. Okay. So there's a sense in which these are distinctions or norms where authority can override it, and they're cross-culturally variable. If somebody raises their hand, no one's that bothered by it. But if the teacher says, look, when you're having a dispute with somebody in your class, I often ask you to use your words to help work things out. But from now on, just punch them. Now, the kids don't go, you know, I've been waiting my entire life for you to tell me this, right? And in fact, they're not going to allow even her or God to say, that's okay. So it's morally bad, it's not open to authority, and it tends to be much more universal. Okay. The idea is that in psychopaths, there seems to be a deficiency in recognizing that distinction, suggesting they just don't get this aspect of the moral domain. Okay, so here's what I want to do. I want to show you basically 4 pieces of data that are going to bear on the underlying mechanism or computation that I think is going to push us to think hard about what the problem actually is. So the first study was done in collaboration with Adrian Glenn and Adrian Rain's group at UPenn. It was an fMRI study where these are people who are not criminal psychopaths. They are people who have been evaluated on the Hare scale as being high in the psychopathic range of the scale. They were put in an fMRI scanner with control subjects who were not judged to be high on the psychopath scale. They were low on that scale. They're being given the kinds of moral scenarios that Josh Green developed, that we also have used with ventral medial patients and here with psychopaths. The first point is that when they are reading these scenarios, compared with controls, they show lower levels of activation in the amygdala. This is a fairly consistent finding with a lot of studies looking at psychopaths and activation in the amygdala. So from a functional perspective, lower levels of activation in an area critically involved, obviously, in certain aspects of emotional processing. We then compare the proportion of these subjects' judgments on these moral scenarios, comparing these impersonal cases with the personal cases, healthy controls versus psychopaths. Okay, so the impersonal cases are like the bystander trolley problem. Flip a switch, kill 1 person, save 5. The personal cases are like the footbridge case, pushing the fat guy off the bridge. He dies, but you save 5. What we find is no difference between healthy controls and psychopaths for the impersonal case, and no difference between their personal judgments, but critically, both groups are showing the predicted pattern. Typically, impersonal cases are judged as more permissible than are personal cases. So at this level, psychopaths, non-criminal psychopaths, are no different than healthy controls on these moral decisions, despite the fact that they're showing lower levels of activation in the amygdala. Therefore, regardless of what you think the amygdala is doing, there's certainly a wealth of information showing that it plays some role in emotional processing. So whatever deficit comes along from that lower level of activation, that's not having an impact on these kinds of moral judgments. Let's push that further. Now let's talk about a population of criminal psychopaths conducted with my colleague Mike Achima in Holland. These were 14 prison-convicted psychopaths evaluated again on the Hare scale, compared with 23 non-psychopathic delinquents with many of the same kinds of crimes committed: murders, pedophilia, extortion, and so forth. and 35 age and sex match control, that means males. They read 21 moral dilemmas, again asking yes or no on permissibility judgments, and again the impersonal-personal distinction. And what we find, again, is no group difference for the impersonal cases. Here are the psychopaths here are the delinquents, and here are the healthy controls. And no difference at all, again, on the personal cases. So no matter how you measure it, no matter how you cut out the data, we find no difference in the moral judgments of psychopaths relative to delinquents who clearly have some kind of problem but are not psychopathic, and relative to healthy controls who at the measures we had no problems either. So again, whatever the deficit is for psychopaths, it's not playing any role in their moral judgments. So to conclude, there are some serious puzzles and resolutions that need to be solved here. One is the fact that our studies of ventral medial prefrontal patients showed a very selective deficit in these moral scenarios. That is, when you pit personal harms versus a greater good, the ventral medial patients go much more towards the utilitarian end. So what's going on there that contrasts the ventral medial patients with psychopaths? This is not yet clear to me. Secondly, we've tried to replicate a bunch of the emotional priming studies by priming people with facial expressions, disgusting smells like fart spray, disgusting images, and we are failing to replicate some of the patterns that are out there in literature which typically report very low effect sizes. So what the role of emotion is, to me, is still unclear, at least based on some of these priming studies. Lastly, is an opportunity that's kind of undergoing investigation right now with Jack von Honk from Holland, which to look at a very unique population of people with a disorder called Urbach-Vita. This is a mutation which causes bilateral damage in the amygdala selectively, such that by the time they're adults, these people lack an amygdala completely. So if you want to look at what is selectively done by losing a core component of the emotional system, this will be very telling in terms of the outcome for the moral decision-making system. Thank you.